You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is now a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. For joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is historian and author Will Inboden. He received his PhD in history from Yale University. He used to work in the Bush White House a few years ago, and he has written a brand new book, which I have read and highly, highly recommend. It's called The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan in the White House and the World. Professor Inboden, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Robert. It's great to be with you.
Well, your book it's an eye-opener. You know, a lot of us who tend to gravitate toward certain periods of history. I don't know how many books I've read on Watergate, 15. I mean, the list goes on and on, right? You're always looking to learn something new when you pick up a book about that subject. And I can definitely say I learned a lot about reading your book. I'm a huge Cold War history fan. Reagan at Reykjavik by Ken Edelman is one of my favorite books. But in reading yours, you tell so much of the backstory. This is what happened when the doors were closed. This is what they said to each other in private letters that I found it really illuminating and just want to take my hat off to you.
Well, thank you very much. I sure do appreciate that, and that's the highest praise, of course, that an author can get is a happy reader who feels like you learned something from it, and you certainly understand what I was trying to do in researching and writing the book.
Well, plus we both agree that Ryan Streeter is one smart SOB.
Yeah, that's right. So, Ryan, I hope you're listening. You got a number of fans here, certainly with the two of us. So.
Let's get right into it. Your book chronicles Ronald Reagan's Cold War foreign policy from the time he was elected in November of 1980 until he relinquished office on January 20th, 1989. I'm going to ask you some kind of general questions to set the tone for the Leaders and Legends audience, and then we'll get into maybe some specifics. What did Ronald Reagan get wrong about the Cold War, the Soviet Union, and sort of his overall approach to foreign policy?
So, it's a great question because a lot of what I talk about in the book, of course, is the many big picture things I think he got right. But again, no president was perfect. I think Reagan was perhaps a little more optimistic about the possibility of eventually getting to abolishing all nuclear weapons, getting an agreement with the Soviets to abolish all nuclear weapons. It's certainly something he worked towards in the second half of his presidency. But he and Gorbachev couldn't quite get there. He was, this is not so much a policy question, but a personnel one. He was, I think, wrong in some of the people he picked for his team early on who didn't necessarily share his views of the Soviet Union or his theory of the case. The main one there, of course, would be Secretary of State Al Haig, who Haig was a little bit more from he was a protege of Nixon and Kissinger. And more coming from the détente school of wanting to look for areas of cooperation and reduce tensions with the Soviets, rather than Reagan's belief in their vulnerability.
The only thing I could think of when you were writing about, and you do such a good job of describing him, is is when William Seward attempted to kind of take over the Lincoln administration in the first years of the first months of the Cold War. What is it about Haig or secretaries of state when they tend to kind of just get out over their skis a bit?
Yeah, and one of the keys to understanding Haig, of course, is he always wanted to be president. He thought he should have been president. And when Reagan picked him as Secretary of State or offered it to him, Reagan's team said to Haig, "Listen, we're only going to offer this to you if you understand you're not the president." And Haig, of course, said the right things. I know I'm not the president, but he just in his heart of hearts, he just had not given up that hope. And so when Reagan is lying there in the hospital bed after the assassination attempt in March of 1981, and Haig has that very infamous, I'm in charge here. I tried to give some context for how he said that, but everyone was reading it through you really do think that you're the president. So
it would have been better if he'd at least gotten the Constitution right, but he didn't even get that. He wasn't even actually. I mean, he was technically in charge because he was in the room, but he had to say, "This is the Constitution we have here, gentlemen," and he didn't seem to get that.
He was putting himself out of the vice president and the Speaker of the House and the President pro tem of the Senate. So.
What did Ronald Reagan, in broad terms, and let's say Reaganism, what did they get right about the Cold War in the Soviet Union and the world?
So, I think the key to understanding Reagan's strategy, his Cold War vision, his theory of the case, as I mentioned, is when he took office, he saw the Soviet Union as a combination of strong and weak. He recognized its military strength and its rather malevolent threat towards our European allies, our Asian allies, and even to the United States itself, because the Kremlin did have a formidable military. But he also recognized its weaknesses. Its terribly inefficient and corrupt economy, its illegitimacy in the eyes of so many of its own people who, resented essentially being prisoners in their country without, any political or religious freedoms, and the ideological bankruptcy of communism. And we look back in hindsight, and it seems rather obvious that the Soviet Union would be brittle and weak. But as I try to point out in the book, very few people recognized that at the time, and Reagan was out of step with expert opinion. The Soviet Union had been there for several decades, and it was assumed by most foreign policy experts it was going to continue to be there for several more decades. And so, for Reagan, it was about recognizing the strength and threat from the Soviet Union in the near term and deterring that, but also recognizing its weakness, its vulnerability, and exploiting that.
That's a great point. It leads me to my next question, which I'm going to ask my next question first, and then my next question, which you led me right into. It's fair to say that Ronald Reagan, that the view of him personally, the estimation of his intelligence, was not positive. That his critics not only thought he was wrong, but they thought he just was intellectually incapable of understanding that he was wrong, which are two different things. Was it Clark Clifford called him an amiable dunce?
Yeah.
Haynes Johnson wrote that book, Sleepwalking Through History. I think that's what it's called. So there was a lot of condescension about Reagan's intellect and his view of the world. How did President Reagan handle that? And if you had to guess, how do you think he reveled in the fact that he was ultimately proven right and they were proven wrong?
So he was regarded by his critics and elite opinion of the day as wrong and dangerous and dumb. And those are obviously three worrisome things in a president. True. Now, I think all three of those were incorrect, but that's why he inspired so much revulsion and criticism from so many opposing members of Congress and journalists and elite opinion. But Reagan, what really came out in my research from reading, every page of his diary entries, his private correspondence, the transcripts of his meetings with foreign leaders. He was very comfortable with himself. He had a strong Christian faith and, kind of sensed that he was, there to serve God and was, less concerned with public opinion. He was very politically savvy, and he knew that there's a certain advantage to being underestimated by your critics, and so he would sometimes even play that up, and there's even though he was competitive, he liked to win, as any good successful political leader does, and had very strong convictions. He was not a very vain man, and so while every now and then he would take some private relish if he had proved one of his critics wrong or they were put down or something, he was more concerned with doing right by his country, making the world a better place, winning on the issues, rather than necessarily any vanity or any proving of his critics wrong, or any triumphalism like that. So I closed the book with the final foreign policy speech he ever gave in public life in December of 1992. So 4 years after he left the White House, and he's not trying to do an end zone dance on, we won, peaceful victory in the Cold War and everything's great. He is happy about that, but he's also warning his country and the world that, look, challenges still remain. There's still other malevolent forces at work abroad. America still needs to be leading in the world. And, that's partly where I get the title of my book from. His final words are, "The work of freedom is never done, and the task of the peacemaker is never complete." And so I emphasize that partly because that was his message to his country and the world, but also this was not a victory dance for him or a sense of smugness or vindication. He was more concerned that his country would do right and that the issues would be handled appropriately.
And if you had told someone in November 1980 that you were going to write a book about Ronald Reagan after the end of that details his 2 terms, and the title would be Peacemaker, what do you think people would have said to you, given the charge, the fear, the paranoia that Reagan was going to blow up the world?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I would have been ridiculed and laughed off the stage, right? Now, in November of 1980, I had just turned 8 years old, so they'd also wonder what's this 8-year-old kid think he's doing. Okay, so yeah, but no, and I still, as I've seen some early responses to the book, one thing a number of people are seizing on is the title, "The Peacemaker," and saying, wasn't Reagan more of a warmonger? We know now, of course, that he wasn't, but that was the concern even then, and so people. Many Americans, certainly his critics, worried that he was going to lead the nation into a reckless war, maybe even a nuclear war. They certainly didn't see him bringing peace about. They assumed that the Cold War was going to be with us forever, and so they were very skeptical of any of his efforts to actually bring about a victory in it, let alone a peaceful victory. And they didn't take him seriously as a strategist. So I think more was a sense of like, all right, well, hopefully he can help restore the American economy at home, and then we can otherwise survive his dubious foreign policy. But as I try to lay out in the book, from the get-go, he had a much more sophisticated vision of combining pressure and using coercive force towards the Soviets, but also diplomatic outreach and hopes for a negotiated surrender, as I call it.
Take us back to 1980. You were 8, is that what you said?
Yeah.
I was 12,
mm-hmm.
and I remember that time very well. So take the Leaders and Legends audience back to that time when the Cold War was raging. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. Reagan won, I think, 489-49 over Jimmy Carter, a resounding rejection of the incumbent president.
Mm-hmm.
There were demonstrations throughout the world in the hundreds of thousands. And there was this media drumbeat that was anti-Reagan from the get-go.
Mm-hmm.
Just talk for a little bit about what Ronald Reagan stepped into and the forces aligned against him, and kind of what the world was like in 1980, because it was about the worst time I can remember in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously we're dealing with some challenges in the world right now. But I think by, just about any measurement, the fall of 1980 was much worse, right? And when Reagan's elected. And so, first of all, yeah, I'll summarize it this way. It seemed that the Soviet Union was winning the Cold War and the United States was weak and in terminal decline. So our economy was a mess. Unemployment was very high. Inflation was running away. Obviously we're dealing with some, inflation problems now is much worse than. We were coming out of several years of the energy crisis from the Arab oil embargo that had really, crippled so much American industry and even American drivers, having to wait hours at the pump to fill up our cars with very expensive gas. We had the Iran hostage crisis going on. 55 Americans being held hostage over a year in Iran by the revolutionary regime there, another symbol of American weakness. The Sandinistas, supported by the Soviets, had just taken over Nicaragua. You'd had the Nicaraguan Revolution. And that was the culmination of all through the 1970s, communist regimes seemed to be on the march. They had taken over Angola, they had taken over Vietnam, they had taken over part of Yemen. They had taken over Ethiopia. They had taken over Nicaragua. So it seemed that Soviet communism was on the march and America was really weak. And then finally, it seemed to a lot of Americans that the presidency itself was broken. By 1980, the last American president to have completed 2 terms was Eisenhower 20 years earlier. And since then, 5 American presidents had failed to do 2 terms. Kennedy was assassinated. LBJ didn't even run for re-election because he was so crippled by Vietnam. Nixon resigns because of Watergate. His successor, Gerald Ford, doesn't even win re-election for 1 full term. Jimmy Carter had just been defeated by Reagan too. And so there's a sense from a lot of Americans that the presidency itself is broken. And so Reagan inherited a very discouraged, demoralized, weakened nation, and a very difficult hand, both at home and abroad. And that's why I really try to break that out in the book so people understand that the policy successes that he did enjoy were not inevitable, were not foreordained, and very few people expected them at the time.
For the historian looking back, when you write about past events and they turn out in a certain way, of course the North was going to win the Civil War. Of course we're going to win, the United States or whomever is going to win World War II. How tough is it for a historian to tell the story without giving away the ending, even though we all know the ending?
So it's certainly a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge in the researching and writing of it, and then the final crafting of the book. I mean, so one thing I tried to do, and any of our readers here will be the judges of this, is really as much as possible put myself in the mind and looking at the world through the eyes of the people I write about, especially President Reagan, but also others on his senior team. And even though Reagan had a hope and confidence that he was pursuing the right strategy, as I try to show, he didn't know for sure it was going to work out. Nobody knew for sure. And every day, he and his team, when they're going into the West Wing there of the White House, to try to lead America, they're quite literally worried this could be their last day on Earth. This could be, every day is a threat of the world being destroyed in a nuclear holocaust if we go to war with the Soviet Union. And so having that terror and that uncertainty, I think is a way to appreciate just how terrible the pressures were on them, and the difficulty of the decisions that they were making, especially when some of their critics are second guessing them. So when readers read it, I hope they can kind of mentally put themselves into that position and pretend you don't know how the story ends. Hard to do.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're talking with Will Inboden, a professor of history. He has written The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. You talked about reading his diaries, President Reagan's diaries, and all the research that you did. Let's say you get to ask Ronald Reagan 2 questions. What would you have asked him?
Boy, that is a great question. All right, so I can ask him too. I think the first question would be, when did he really decide that his strategy was working in the Cold War? I can see, as I mentioned, he had confidence that it was the right one overall, but you never know for sure. And so I can describe in the book the unfolding of his strategy and some of the adaptations he made. There's never a moment where it seems to click for him where he says, "Aha! Now I know that this is working." That is one. And the other question I would ask him, this is a much more particular one about an episode I describe in the book, is why he didn't launch the retaliatory strikes after the Hezbollah terrorists bombed our Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983. And as you saw, I'm fairly critical of him there. I think it should have been done. This was a horribly traumatic episode for our country. The worst loss of life since for our armed forces since Vietnam. And there was a big debate that Reagan and his team had about should they do retaliatory strikes, and he didn't. And I see some of the indications why, but that's another question I would have liked to have asked him, because I think it's one of it's a mar on what's otherwise a pretty strong policy record.
And it seems to be a theme in your book that the leaders associated with President Reagan who were in the defense realm were more reluctant to use force than, let's say, the people who weren't Secretary of Defense or Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think Vietnam is a big part of it. So, when Reagan took office, when he takes the oath of office in 1981, that's almost 8 years to the day after the last American combat troop had left Vietnam. And as we all know, 8 years goes by quickly. So Vietnam was not ancient history. It was a very recent trauma. And much of what Reagan was trying to do with the military was not just literally rebuild the military with troop increases and better equipment and better weapons, but rebuild and restore the military's morale after what at the time was the first lost war in our country's history. And so that Vietnam hangover pervaded the Pentagon, and rightly made the Pentagon very cautious about using force again and getting maybe dragged into another losing war with unclear goals. Then related to that is, one principle of strategy is setting priorities and making difficult choices about the trade-offs. And for the Pentagon, the priority was rightly deterring and defeating the Soviet Union, full stop. And any potential use of military force that some might see as tangential to that, especially say the mission in Lebanon and Beirut, but even some of the retaliatory strikes against Libya that I discuss in the book, or even the Grenade operation, one could make a case that's a distraction from the main goal of deterring the Soviet Union. So I think that also explains part of it. Ironically, as I described in the book, it was the State Department that was usually more interested or willing in using force than the Pentagon. So.
Is it fair to say that President Reagan and his team's approach wasn't a direct repudiation of détente? Or do you think it's more direct than that? And let me ask the question, in 1980, what was wrong with détente?
And so for your listeners, since détente may be somewhat unfamiliar to our current generation, détente was the strategic approach to relations between the United States and Soviet Union that President Nixon and President Ford, and then National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger had developed. And the idea was, let's look for ways to lessen the tensions between our two countries in the Cold War. It was not about surrendering to the Soviet Union necessarily, but it was about reducing tensions, reducing the risk of the Cold War turning into a hot war and destroying the world. Looking, are there maybe some areas that we can cooperate, or at least ways that we can step back from the precipice of potential conflict because the Cold War had become so dangerous and so costly. And for a time, it does bear some fruit. You've got some initial arms control agreements that the Nixon administration negotiates with the Soviets. The United States is able to reduce our defense budget somewhat after Vietnam, and as we were seeing, it being so harmful to our economy. But what Reagan observed is détente goes from being a temporary change in direction or tone for the Cold War into almost a permanent posture of losing as slowly as possible, and that's still losing. And what Reagan also saw, and some other critics of détente, is by the time the Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979, after advancing with their proxy forces across the rest of the world, détente was becoming a very one-sided game, where the United States was dialing back our defense spending, trying to reduce our confrontation with the Soviets. And the Soviets were just exploiting that. They were pocketing those concessions, taking them to the bank, and trying to advance their power as much as they could. And so for Reagan, he thought the United States needed to jettison détente and adopt a much more confrontational approach towards the Soviets. However, as I point out, that doesn't mean that he wanted to reject every last aspect of détente, and he still wanted to keep the route open for negotiations and for diplomacy. He just wanted to do it with a much stronger hand. He thought that détente had given America a weaker hand.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast, presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. We are talking with author and professor William Inboden, who wrote the book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. And I would spend some time reading the reviews of this book, but they're all so damn good. It would probably take the next 15 minutes. We have some terrific Cold War and just general historians and scholars who've given the big thumbs up to your book, Professor Inboden. So congratulations on that.
Well, thank you. It's always an honor when people I esteem say nice things about it. So,
one of the things, I'm going to start throwing some names at you here for just kind of a quick reaction, but the one thing that I had never read before was about the conversations between Ronald Reagan and Dwight Eisenhower, and that Eisenhower was a real influence on Reagan in kind of the mid 60s. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, this was one of the fun discoveries in my research. And while the book, primarily focuses on President Reagan's 8 years as president, his foreign policy then, in the early chapters, I wanted to give some background on where his ideas and convictions are formed. And to give credit where credit is due, it was a former Reagan advisor and longtime friend, Tom Reed, and then an author in Vermont, Gene Copelson, who had both illuminated for me the really important influence that former President Eisenhower had on President Reagan. And it started when Reagan's first big iconic political moment that some of your listeners may be familiar with is the 1964 campaign when Barry Goldwater is running against LBJ for president, and Reagan gives his very famous "A Time for Choosing" speech. And it's broadcast nationwide and introduces Reagan to America as a potential political voice. Well, former President Eisenhower was retired in Palm Springs at the time, watches that speech and thinks, hey, this Reagan guy's got some real talent. So Eisenhower reaches out to Reagan, says, why don't you come meet with me? I'd like to get to know you some. And Eisenhower essentially encourages Reagan to run for governor of California. So he really starts, inspiring Reagan's early political career. And then over the next few years, they have a series of meetings, build a friendship. And Eisenhower, provides almost, a series of, clinics or tutorials on foreign and defense policy for Reagan, talks about ways that the Johnson administration was getting Vietnam wrong, talks about some of the lessons of World War II, the importance of restoring America's economic strength is key to our military strength and our leadership in the world. But also the importance of being cautious about the use of force and not, getting involved in losing wars with large ground commitments as Vietnam had become. And then once Reagan becomes governor, Eisenhower starts encouraging him to run for president, which was notable because Eisenhower's former vice president, Richard Nixon, was planning to run also, and Eisenhower actually preferred Reagan to Nixon.
Let me throw some names out to you, people you detail in this book a little bit, and you don't have to take very long, but just a paragraph or two, because I really liked in your book some of the personality sketches and how you discussed how important it was to Ronald Reagan to develop these sort of one-on-one relationships built on trust and hey, we can be candid with each other. I'm of course going to completely blow that apart by making the first name I send your way Richard Nixon.
So, yeah, the Reagan-Nixon relationship is just very complicated and fascinating. And I'll try to be brief on this, but as you know, there's a lot that we could go in there. But essentially, these two guys really defined Republican presidential politics for, almost 40 or 50 years, right? I mean, starting with Nixon being Eisenhower's running mate in 1952. Over the next, 40 years or so, either a Reagan or Nixon, or sometimes both of them, is either on the ballot or doing something very influential. They're both from California. They both originally had roots in the Midwest. They both come from impoverished backgrounds, and really climb up to tremendous political success through grit and perseverance and talent. And they both were very respectful of each other, but they were also fierce political rivals. Reagan challenges Nixon initially in '68. Reagan runs against Nixon foreign policy in '76. Then Reagan, of course, himself wins in 1980. But then Nixon, who's in this disgraced exile up in New York at the time, starts writing Reagan almost weekly letters in the White House with unsolicited political advice and policy advice. And Reagan, again, who, as I mentioned, was not one to hold grudges and not very vain, is very interested in this. And he takes a lot of Nixon's advice. He disregards other parts of it. And eventually they build a genuine friendship. They still have their differences. But Reagan, in a gesture of great magnanimity, actually invites Nixon back to the White House. I want to say it's in 1987, his first time setting foot back in the White House again. A very gracious gesture. So it's a fascinating, complicated relationship.
Margaret Thatcher.
So, yeah, she's Reagan's closest friend among other world leaders, and the bonds of friendship and affection and loyalty and trust between them is really strong. Of course, they share free market convictions, they share anti-communist convictions, but also, as I detail in the book, they have tremendous friction. It's almost like an old married couple, if you will. I mean, nothing inappropriate there, right? But they know each other well. They hold each other in very high regard, but they also have big differences over initially the Falklands, and then over Grenada, over the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and they have some very tense exchanges and disputes. But it all takes place within this context of deep commitment to the alliance, deep commitment to each other, and trying to keep a lot of the disputes private in-house. Again, that's where I think the old married couple analogy fits into. So Thatcher is very important to him.
Another person you mentioned several times, and I think give due credit, and maybe he doesn't get mentioned enough. I don't know. I don't want to judge, but to me, and if there is a watershed event of the Cold War, for some reason, and maybe it's because I'm Catholic, I think it's the election of Karol Wojtyła to become Pope John Paul II in a brilliant strategic move by the Vatican. What about the relationship between the Pope and the President? And just how important do you think John Paul II was to how events eventually unfolded?
Supremely important. Yeah. And for your listeners, be forewarned, it's a fairly longish book, but the earlier draft was about twice as long. My publisher had me pare it back quite a bit. I only mention that because the earlier draft had a lot more material on Reagan's relationship with the Pope. And I do think it's very important. And just a few themes to highlight. when the Pope is, first selected in 1978, Reagan is out of office at the time, but Reagan is fascinated by this. He gives a number of radio addresses talking about the importance of the first Polish Pope, the first non-Italian Pope in centuries. He's captivated by the Pope's first visit back to Poland, under the boot heel of Soviet communism. And another thing that brings the deep bond between Reagan and the Pope is within 2 months apart in 1981, they both survive assassination attempts that very nearly killed them. And Reagan, had his own very strong Christian faith. Of course, the Pope is defined by his Christian faith, and so they both have this kind of shared sense of providential destiny that God has spared their lives to help bring a peaceful end to the Cold War. So they both hate communism. Reagan is very deeply committed to religious freedom, especially for Christians and Jews, and does a lot to support persecuted Catholics behind the Iron Curtain. And they share a lot of intelligence. Reagan regularly has, his CIA director, Bill Casey, is a very devout Catholic. He regularly has Casey and other senior officials, Bill Clark, going over to the Vatican to give the Pope, intelligence briefings. And of course, the Pope has his own great intelligence network of, bishops and priests behind the Iron Curtain who are, sending him information, which he in turn would pass on to the White House. So it's a very, very important relationship. It really defines so much of the spiritual aspects of the Cold War.
So much of the Cold War discussion, once you get past Vietnam and the opening to China in February of 1972, really focuses on Europe. Mm-hmm. But what you did in your book is talk a lot about Reagan's elevation of the relationship between the United States and Japan, and his support for Prime Minister Nakasone and Nakasone's support for the United States in its geopolitical goals. That was really a part of the book that I had never really understood or hadn't encountered before, and I thought it was a terrific addition. Why did you decide to make that such a strong point of what you wrote?
Yeah, well, this was one of the surprises, Robert, in my research, was just how important Asia in general and Japan in particular were to Reagan and his overall, strategic vision for the Cold War. And again, we need to remember, even though so much of the Cold War seemed focused on Europe, with the Iron Curtain and Berlin Wall, it really was a global war. And, Japan was, just right offshore from the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet Union had very, aggressive designs in the Asia Pacific region. And when Reagan took office, most Americans saw Japan as primarily an economic rival. We were dealing with Japan was, doing unfair trade practices. It was really hurting American manufacturing. But also, of course, Americans were buying more and more consumer goods and automobiles made in Japan. But there was a real frustration with a lot of Americans that some of Japan's economic gains were coming at our expense. And Reagan had to pay heed to that, but his vision was to transform the U.S.-Japan relations from primarily an economic rivalry to primarily a strategic partnership. And I'd mentioned Thatcher earlier, but I think Reagan's other closest friend among world leaders was actually the Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone. They're both very charismatic. They really connected on kind of a deep personal level. They both took political risks for each other. And just to give your listeners one example of how Reagan's able to make that relationship work, when he takes office, one of our frustrations was Japan was just free riding on the American security umbrella. They were, putting hardly any money into their own military. They were depending on the American Seventh Fleet to keep them safe. And Reagan persuades Nakasone over the next 8 years to triple Japan's defense spending. This is, like I said, 3 times as much, not just a percentage increase, 3 times as much. And Nakasone did that at tremendous political cost himself. But with Japan spending a lot more on its own defense, that freed up our Navy and Air Force to focus more on countering the Soviets rather than just only having to defend Japan. And so it's a great example of a close friendship that also pays tremendous strategic benefits for the United States and put a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union on their Eastern front when they were also focused with challenges on their Western front.
Is George Shultz the greatest or most impactful Secretary of State in American history?
I come close to saying that. I think he certainly is the greatest Secretary of State since John Quincy Adams back, of the Monroe Doctrine back in the 19th century. Schultz is an indispensable partner for Reagan. Schultz is really key to so much of Reagan's diplomatic successes, and with apologies to other great Secretaries of State, Henry Kissinger, James Baker, Dean Acheson,
John Hay. Where's John Hay get his juice?
John Hay, no, that's right. There's been some great ones, but the 6.5 years that Schultz served as Secretary of State, he is, Reagan's indispensable partner for pressure and diplomacy with the Soviet Union. He plays a tremendous leadership role in the peaceful democratic transitions in so many countries in Asia and Latin America. He, eventually is able to really advance America's interests in the Middle East as well. If you talk to old career Foreign Service officers, career diplomats in the State Department, almost all of them will speak with reverence for Schultz, saying he was the greatest one that they ever served under. And most of them will say, look, I'm a Democrat. I never voted for the Reagan administration, but Schultz was the greatest Secretary of State. So I hope my book helps give him some due.
Last but not least, Mikhail Gorbachev. And how did Reagan's policies purposefully lead to the emergence of the reformist leader that President Reagan had been seeking since he became president?
So I love the way you asked that question, Robert, because I can tell you really picked up on one of the important arguments in my book. And, for your listeners, there's a debate among a lot of scholars and policymakers over who deserves more credit for the peaceful end of the Cold War, Reagan or Gorbachev. And Gorbachev is very important. I'll mention more on that in a moment. But one of the things I argue in the book is that Reagan developed policies from early on that were deliberately designed to pressure the Soviet Union to produce a reformist leader. And Reagan had been in office over 4 years before Gorbachev even comes to power. But Reagan had laid out the strategy very early on that he wanted to bring the political and military and economic and diplomatic pressure on the Soviet system so that the Politburo, the geriatric old communists, old Bolsheviks running the country would have no choice but to find a more reform-minded leader who could actually negotiate with the Americans. And they finally picked that in Gorbachev. And that's one reason why Reagan recognized Gorbachev as a reformist leader earlier than most, is he'd been looking for one. That's why I give Reagan a little more credit for Gorbachev than others have done before.
Time magazine famously or infamously named Mikhail Gorbachev the man of the 80s, the man of the decade, instead of just the man of the year. Mm-hmm. Would you have chosen him?
I would not have. I would have chosen Reagan. I would have, certainly given Gorbachev plenty of credit. But like I said, I think that it's hard to see Gorbachev come into power the way he did or when he did if it had not been for Reagan's policies. And as you know, Robert, from the epilogue, I get one of the main sources of the book's title, The Peacemaker, comes from Gorbachev. That's a tribute he pays to Reagan after Reagan dies, and Gorbachev says he was, a great peacemaker. So
your epilogue is beautiful. It's a very quick description of Mikhail Gorbachev's visit to Ronald Reagan's casket, where he touches the casket and later says, I just gave him a pat. It's beautiful. Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah. Ronald Reagan has so many good lines. It's kind of hard to select one, but honestly, my favorite always has been when they kept asking him, is he going to meet with the leader of the Soviet Union? And he, as a 72, 74, 75-year-old man, says, they keep dying on me.
Yeah. So, yeah. In the space of 3 years, 3 Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, and then Andropov, and then Chernenko, they all die on him. And it kind of symbolized the disease and the rot within the Soviet system itself, that even its leaders keep dying from ill health and age.
Reagan always believed, and it comes through in your book, that if you could talk to the Russian people, that they would tell you the Soviet Union is on the last leg. I remember in Ken Edelman's book, Reagan at Reykjavik, I think it's Gorbachev who snaps, and correct me if I'm wrong, I haven't read the book in several years, but says something to Foreign Minister Shevardnadze of the Soviet Union, like, we can't even provide our people with toothpaste. Like, that's how bad things are. And here we are, trying to be a player on the world stage. how did Ronald Reagan seem to connect with the Russian people, even though he only visited the country once? You talk about that, the dissidents. You are our only friend in the world, or something like that. You're the only thing we have going. Go ahead.
Yeah. No, and I'm glad you mentioned Ken Edelman's Reagan at Reykjavik book, because that really is a terrific one, and I hope your listeners will read that one too. Ken's a friend and was great help to me in putting this book together. This is very important understanding. Reagan hated Soviet communism, but he had no ill will towards the Soviet people, especially the Russian people. Soviet Union, of course, was several different countries mashed together and held together, but he was rather fascinated by the Russian people, and anytime he would meet with Russian dissidents who'd been released from prison and exiled to America. He was always asking them about conditions inside the country. What are the people like? He was fascinated with the resilience of religious faith among so many of the Soviet people, even though they were living under an officially atheistic system. This is where the American author Suzanne Massey plays an important role in the story, where she would travel to Russia a lot, meeting with literary figures there and cultural figures, and would come back and meet with Reagan in the White House. And he always wanted to ask her, what are the Russian people thinking? What are they feeling? What do they think of America? What do they think of me? What do they think of their government? And so that's why he did so much outreach directly to them, with his speeches, with radio broadcasts, and of course with his iconic visit to Moscow in May of 1988. And part of his strategy was to support the Soviet people in their own desire for a better life, and that better life would entail getting rid of their wicked government, the wicked system that was oppressing them.
June. I know you're going to be. You could finish for me, Professor Inboden. I know you could. June 12th, 1987. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. You detail in your book the internal debate within the Reagan administration of the president even saying that line. Mm-hmm. It's a terrific part of your book that it keeps getting yanked out and it keeps getting put back in. And ultimately, it seems that Ronald Reagan says, no, I want to say this. Please describe to us a little bit about that internal debate and the effect of Ronald Reagan saying that to the world, to the Berliners, that June day.
Thanks for highlighting this. It's a very important part of the story, and again, really shows presidential leadership at its finest. Because, as you mentioned there, almost all expert opinion at the State Department, within the National Security Council, Secretary Shultz himself were telling Reagan, don't say those words, it's going to be too provocative. But the background really matters. Reagan had always hated the Berlin Wall. He had first visited it in 1978. He'd been back in 1982. So this was not a kind of a one-off impulsive taunt on his part. He saw the Berlin Wall. And again, for your younger listeners, the context is the Soviet Union had built a prison-like concrete wall covered with barbed wire, dividing Soviet-controlled East Berlin from free West Berlin. And it was not the wall was not designed to keep West Berliners out of East Germany. It was designed to keep trap the East German people inside their own country. And so for Reagan, that just epitomized the barbarity of communism, that it would build walls to keep its own people imprisoned, and that it would divide such a historic and powerful country like Germany, its capital city. So he had long wanted to see the wall come down. And in 1987, he's built already a pretty good relationship with Gorbachev. He's met with Gorbachev twice in Geneva and then Reykjavik. There's a sense that maybe, reform and even peace and reduced tensions are in the air. But Reagan was not going to take his foot off the gas, if you will. And so when he goes to Berlin and he gives that iconic speech, he wants to say this wall needs to go. But he doesn't just say tear down this wall. He says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's his direct challenge.
Big difference.
And it's a reminder to everybody, it's not the Germans who put up the wall dividing their capital city. It's the imperialist Soviet communists. And they put it up and they can tear it down. And again, Reagan is ridiculed for saying that. Foreign policy experts say it's a silly taunt. It'll never happen. But the people who matter most are the people of Berlin, and they hear that message and they know the United States, the American president, is on our side. He's on the side of restoring our freedom. He's on the side of reunifying our country and our capital city. And that, certainly plays a role in inspiring them to later, tear down the wall just, less than 2.5 years later in November of '89 as he calls for it. So Gorbachev, of course, didn't like hearing it, but Reagan, every time he saw Gorbachev after that, said, "I meant it. Tear that thing down."
We have a few more minutes with Professor Inboden talking about his book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. You mentioned Reagan being ridiculed by the intelligentsia and the media and maybe perhaps the career bureaucrat in federal government. But for however much he was ridiculed for saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," it was substantially less than the ridicule he faced and overcame in a lot of ways regarding the Strategic Defense Initiative, ridiculed as Star Wars. In our last few minutes here, before we get to the final 5 questions that we ask all of our guests, which I promise, Professor, are harmless.
Okay. All right.
The Reagan's staunch belief in SDI was perhaps matched only by the Soviets' staunch in SDI, while so many other countries' leaders, academics, scientists, media members, politicians, elected officials thought it was a complete joke and said, "It'll never work. What are you doing?" And that leads right to the Reykjavik summit where President Reagan has this monumental deal on the table and he walks away from it because he won't give up SDI. And I think it's one of the most courageous acts of foreign policy leadership in our country's history. So I've rambled. Talk to us about SDI, why he thought it was so important, and why the Soviets were so petrified of it.
So, yes, exactly. It's supremely important. And, for your listeners, Reagan's vision with SDI was building essentially a very elaborate missile defense system, which could shoot Soviet nuclear missiles out of the sky. And there were 2 big strategic concepts behind that. The first was his entire defense buildup and modernization had not just been about outbuilding the Kremlin, outbuilding the Soviet army, but also outsmarting it, of taking American technology, our edges in semiconductors, in communications technology and stealth technology, and building weapons systems that are so much more advanced than anything the Soviets can have, that no matter how much more they build in quantity, they will never match us in quality. The second strategic principle for Reagan was he wanted to move away from the balance of terror in the Cold War, this mutual assured destruction, that the way to guarantee that the other side doesn't incinerate us in a nuclear attack is that we threaten to incinerate them. And that was called MAD, mutual assured destruction. And he thought it was quite literally MAD. And so instead, his strategic innovation was he wanted to move to a world beyond nuclear weapons where we could break out of that. And so his vision for SDI was born of that. The technology, of course, was not developed at the time, but he's visionary. He's somewhat of a dreamer. He says, "Look, America has always been able to develop the world's leading technological innovations for our economy, for our military before. Let's at least give this a try." And Gorbachev was fascinated by and mesmerized by and also terrified by America's technological advantages as well. And so he really thought SDI could work too, which is why Gorbachev tried so desperately to persuade Reagan to give it up. But Reagan wouldn't, because it was such a fundamental cornerstone of his entire strategy for bringing the Cold War to a peaceful end and ending the threat of the world being destroyed in a nuclear exchange.
We have reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Professor Inboden, are you ready?
I am.
What was your first job?
So, my first job was as a 12-year-old selling Pepsis at University of Arizona football games. I was a hawker, and on a good night, I would make $18 to $20, and as long as I didn't drink all the profits. So.
That's a pretty great answer.
I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, so shout out to Tucson there. Yeah.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
So Well, my parents tell me that my first concert was seeing the Eagles in 1975 when I was 3 years old, when they took me to it. But apparently I slept through the whole thing. My first real concert that I actually remember, and this is an iconic one, was U2's Joshua Tree Tour at Sun Devil Stadium in 1987, where they filmed part of Rattle and Hum. So it was still one of the all-time great shows.
Oh, brilliant. All right. These next three are tough, not because they're malicious, just because they're tough for historians.
Okay.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Oh boy, this is you can see on the screen here, I'm surrounded by a massive bookshelf. So,
and I feel halfway decent about my book collection because a lot of the same books in mine are sitting on your shelves and probably Chris Spangle's. So it makes me feel like I'm halfway smart.
So anyway, all right, well, I'll do a different one here, which isn't a history one, but it is a book that I've returned to over and over the years, is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I'm a man of Christian faith myself, and I just find that such a wonderful explanation of the truths of Christianity, but also just really speaking into the human condition in ways that are really timeless. So I seem to return to that every few years. It was first written in the early 1940s, but is certainly a one I would recommend to just about anybody who hasn't had the pleasure of reading it.
And what's the title again?
Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. So the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, among others.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Oh, wow. I would have loved to have been at the United States Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, 1787 to 89. Just sort of seen so much of the birth of our country there, but also so many of the debates about the proper role of state and federal government and the three branches of government, not just as a exercise in governing, but real exercise in forming the identity of our country. And a lot of the debates we're still having today.
The last question is, if you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record to discuss anything you want, whom would you choose?
Oh boy. Well, I will say Henry Kissinger. He is 99 years old. So obviously he won't, with human mortality being what it is, none of us are here forever, and obviously his days will have their limits. But he pops up in my book a few times. I've had a few conversations with him over the years,
but
a chance to have a one-on-one conversation for a couple of hours. So much of his life spans so much of the most pivotal events, starting with World War II and the Cold War, and the shifting tectonic plates of the 21st century. He's a great historian, obviously a great statesman, and a fascinating person.
I actually read his PhD thesis or dissertation.
Oh, a world restored, right? So,
yeah, and it was I understood most of it, but I'm sitting there going, man, this dude really kind of knows what he's talking about. It was a brilliant book.
Yeah. He is amazing. It's an amazing mind.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest has been Professor William Inboden. He is the Executive Director and William Powers Jr. Chair, the Clements Center for National Security. He is also an author, and I can say that his last book that we've discussed on this podcast, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink, is absolutely wonderful. You mentioned that it is rather long at about 490 pages. I read it in 6 days. I couldn't put it down. It was amazing. It's a wonderful work of scholarship. Very, very readable. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Robert. I've had a delightful time. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.